When my grandfather died, the family lawyer looked at me, the way people look at someone who has already been warned not to make a scene. I was 30 years old, sitting in a mahogany-paneled office that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, listening to men in expensive suits discuss my family's future as if I had never been part of it. Then Mr. Bellamy adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and said, very carefully, "As you know, the Langford Family Trust was restructured 12 years ago. 12 years ago, when I was 18, he didn't need to explain the rest. I already knew what was coming. What I didn't know, what nobody else in that room knew, was that by then my net worth was more than triple the entire trust they had used to control me. And if you've ever sat in a room full of people who thought money made them untouchable, then you already know this. Nothing terrifies them more than losing the power they thought they were born to keep. Before I tell you what happened in that office, and why my mother could barely look at me while my brother smirked like he'd already won, let me take you back to the summer I turned 18. Because that was the year my family decided I was too different to deserve a future with my own last name attached to it. And if this story resonates with you, like and subscribe. But only if you know what it feels like to be punished for becoming yourself. I grew up in Connecticut, in a town full of old stone walls, horse farms, and families who use the phrase, "summering in Maine," as if that were a normal sentence. The Langfords had lived there long enough that people said our name with recognition before they said it with affection. My grandfather, Charles Langford, had built the trust from a manufacturing business that started small and then spread into commercial real estate, logistics, and a long list of quiet investments nobody at school ever understood, but everyone respected. We were not flashy rich. We were legacy rich, which is another way of saying our money came with rules, rituals, and a very polished form of emotional blackmail. Our house sat on a hill behind black iron gates, the kind that opened silently and made every visitor feel slightly inspected. It was white brick, symmetrical, expensive, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. My mother liked pale flowers arranged in silver bowls. My father liked silence. My older brother, Graham, liked whatever my father liked. And I learned early that in our family, love was often measured by how little trouble you caused. Graham was 2 years older than me and had the kind of blonde, easy confidence that made adults describe him as solid. Solid meant predictable. Solid meant he wore navy blazers without irony and shook hands properly at 14. Solid meant he wanted what was expected of him before anyone had to say it out loud. I was the opposite. I asked questions at the wrong moments. I hated the dresses my mother chose for charity dinners. I once told a woman at a fundraiser that I didn't understand why everyone kept praising donations made with photographers present. I was 12. My mother smiled through her teeth the entire ride home. By high school, my differences had become less charming and more offensive. I liked rebuilding things. Furniture, old radios, broken watches I found at estate sales. I liked numbers, but not the kind my father respected. He loved balance sheets when they reinforced status. I loved numbers when they revealed inefficiency, hidden value, or the chance to make something overlooked useful again. At 16, I had already started flipping secondhand pieces online. Nothing dramatic. A chair I refinished in the garage. A mid-century lamp I rewired myself. An ugly dresser I bought for $40 and sold for $600. I liked the logic of it. Find what others dismissed. See what it could become. Put in the work. Let the outcome speak. It sounds obvious now. Back then, my family treated it like a symptom. My mother said it was unbecoming. My father said it was a hobby for people who lacked direction. Graham said it smelled weird in the garage. Only my grandfather ever asked me real questions. What did you pay for it? What's your margin? How long did it take? What did everyone else miss? He never praised me too quickly. That was what I liked about him. He made you prove you understood your own success. When I was 17, he stood in the garage while I stripped paint off a walnut cabinet and said, "You don't think like the rest of them." I braced for criticism. Instead, he picked up one of my tools, turned it in his hand, and added, "That may end up being expensive for them." At the time, I thought he meant someday they would regret underestimating me. I did not yet understand he meant they would make sure I paid for being different long before regret ever reached them. The summer before college, the pressure in our house became a living thing. Graham had already been accepted into Princeton. My mother said it the way other women spoke about miracles. I had gotten into Columbia. Not for the program my father wanted. Not economics. Not law track. Architecture and urban systems. With an emphasis on adaptive reuse and financial modeling. I loved it immediately. My father hated it on sight. He didn't say hate. Of course. My father never wasted bluntness when precision could do more damage. He said things like, "That seems diffuse." Or, "I'm not sure that signals seriousness." Or my favorite, "I assume this is a phase before you settle into something more durable." Durable. In our house, durable was code for respectable. Respectable was code for approved. Approved was code for obedient. My mother tried a different approach. She took me shopping. That was always her strategy when she wanted to improve me into someone else. She walked me through stores full of cream silk and structured coats, lifting hangers with the solemnity of a museum curator. "You can still reinvent yourself before school starts," she said. I was standing in front of a mirror in a fitted ivory dress that made me look like a junior board member at a nonprofit I did not believe in. "I'm not trying to reinvent myself," I said. She smoothed the sleeve at my shoulder. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the problem." At home, dinner conversations became less like meals and more like performance reviews. My father asked Graham about internships and mentors. He asked me whether I was still playing around with online resale. My mother asked whether I had considered joining the right clubs once school began so I could meet the right families. Graham asked whether Columbia had enough ivy on the buildings to make my degree feel legitimate. They laughed. I learned to chew more slowly. It bought me time. That was also the summer the trust started coming up more often. Not directly. Never directly. Money in our family was discussed like weather around people too young to control it. Always present. Rarely explained. I knew the Langford family trust existed. Every grandchild had heard about it in abstract. Ceremonial terms? Legacy. Stewardship. Stability. Responsibility. What it really meant was simple. The trust funded education, housing assistance, certain business ventures, and later distributions based on age, conduct, and what my grandfather called alignment with family values. That phrase should have alarmed me sooner. At 17, I still believed family values meant honesty, diligence, and discretion. I had not yet learned it, mostly meant compliance. The official conversation happened 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. I remember the date because it was hot enough that the hydrangeas near the front walk had begun to brown at the edges. And because I had spent the morning sanding down a brass-framed mirror I'd found at a church sale in New Haven. When I came inside, my mother told me my father wanted me in his study. That room always felt like entering a courtroom before a sentence. Dark shelves, leather chairs, a bar cart, no one touched in daylight. My father sat behind his desk. My mother sat near the window. Graham stood with one shoulder against a bookcase, pretending not to enjoy what was coming. There were folders on the desk. That should have told me everything. Sit down, Helena, my father said. That was how I knew this was serious. He only used my full name when warmth would have weakened the point. I sat. My mother folded her hands in her lap. My father looked at the top page in front of him. Your grandfather and I have discussed the trust, he said. And concerns have been raised. I let the sentence hang there for a moment. Concerns about what? My mother answered instead. Your direction? My direction. Yes, she said, as if repetition might make me hear myself through her. Your choices, your presentation, your general resistance to guidance. I remember staring at her. Presentation. I had expected criticism of my major. Maybe of my business. Maybe of my mouth. Presentation was a subtler insult. It meant my clothes, my posture, my refusal to perform softness on command. The fact that I had cut my hair shorter than she liked and stopped pretending to enjoy conversations with women who assessed girls like auction items. My father continued. The trust exists to support members of this family who uphold its standards and are capable of protecting what generations before them built. And I'm not? He clasped his hands. At present, you have shown very little evidence of alignment. Alignment. There it was again. I looked toward my mother. She did not look ashamed, just tired, as if my personality had become an exhausting administrative issue. What exactly does that mean? I asked. It means, Graham said from the bookcase, you don't act like a Langford. I turned to him. And you do? He gave a small shrug. Well enough. My father didn't correct him. That hurt more than if he had agreed outright. He simply slid one of the folders toward me. Inside was a set of documents I was clearly not meant to understand emotionally before understanding legally. Addendum, structure revision, conduct clause, deferred beneficiary removal. I read the same paragraph 3 times before it settled into language my body could process. My status as a future beneficiary had been suspended pending review. Suspended. At 18. Because I was difficult. Because I was embarrassing. Because I was different. I looked up. You're cutting me out. My mother's voice came soft and measured. No one is cutting you out. This is an opportunity to reflect and mature. That was her favorite kind of cruelty. The kind dressed as refinement. My father leaned back slightly. If, over time, your choices demonstrate greater stability and better judgment, this can be revisited. Over time? Yes. How much time? That depends on you. Which meant it depended on them. On how well I learned to become smaller. On how convincingly I apologized for existing at the wrong angle. I set the folder down carefully, because I had already learned that if I moved too quickly, they would use my emotions as evidence against me. So Graham keeps his place? He has shown consistency, my father said. Of course he has. Helena. No. Say it plainly. I said, he keeps his place because he acts the way you want. And I lose mine because I don't. My mother's jaw tightened. This is exactly the response your father was worried about. For a second, I could not breathe properly. Not because of the money. Not only because of the money, because there is a special kind of betrayal in realizing your family has built an entire system to reward resemblance and punish difference. And because they had done it so calmly, like this was not rejection. Like this was strategy. I looked at my father. Did Grandpa agree to this? That was the one question that changed the room. Not dramatically, but enough. My father answered too fast. He understands the importance of preserving standards. That was not a yes. Even then I knew it. I also knew I had already lost the moment. There are rooms where truth matters. There are rooms where hierarchy matters more. This was one of those. I stood, gathered the folder, and said the only thing I could say without crying in front of Graham. If being a Langford means this, then maybe I should stop trying. My mother said my name sharply. My father said, "Don't be theatrical." I walked out anyway. That night I sat on the garage floor in old jeans with the brass mirror leaning against a workbench beside me and cried so hard my ribs hurt. Not graceful tears. Not the quiet kind. The ugly kind that leave your face hot and your throat raw and make you feel 14 and foolish and furious all at once. I kept hearing their words in different order. Direction. Alignment. Standards. Different. As if they had taken every part of me that felt alive and translated it into liability. Around midnight, I heard the side door open. I wiped my face with the heel of my hand and turned. My grandfather stood in the doorway. He was still broad-shouldered then, though slower than he used to be. With a cane he hated, and a gaze that made weaker men confess things they had never been asked. He looked at me, then at the folder in my lap. "So," he said, "they've gone ahead with it. There are moments that split your life into before and after." That sentence was one. Because it told me three things instantly. He knew. He hadn't stopped it. And he was not surprised. I stood too quickly. "You let them." He did not pretend not to understand. "Yes." The word hit harder than anything my father had said. I laughed once, but it came out broken. "Why?" He looked around the garage, at the half-finished pieces, the organized tools, the ledgers I kept in a metal file box. Then he said, "Because I wanted to see what you'd build without it." I stared at him. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard. "You cut me out as a test?" I paused your place. "You call that different?" He came farther inside and closed the door behind him. The garage light was unflattering. That may have helped. It made us both look more honest. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "If I hand you comfort now, Your parents will spend the next decade using it to leash you. Every apartment, every tuition payment, every opportunity will come with correction. You will learn to survive them by becoming them, and that would be a waste. I should tell you I was not moved by this speech in the moment. I was enraged. There is no noble interpretation of being sacrificed for your own growth when you are 18 and freshly humiliated. You don't get to call this wisdom. I said, you let them say I wasn't worthy. His expression changed then. Only slightly. But enough. I let them reveal what they value. He said, that is not the same thing. Convenient. It may be. It is also true. I hated him in that moment. I loved him too. Family can make both feelings occupy the same inch of air until you forget which one is choking you. He nodded toward the folder. Read the clauses carefully. I did? No. He said, you read the insult? Read the mechanism. I looked down despite myself. He tapped one section with the end of his cane. The trust can exclude distributions. It cannot stop you from existing line. It cannot stop you from earning. And it cannot stop me from watching. I didn't understand all of what he meant then. I understand it now. He was giving me the first lesson that ever made me rich. Never confuse being excluded from someone else's system with being denied your own future. He left a few minutes later. At the door he paused and said, you are different. I went still. He continued, make sure it becomes expensive. Then he was gone. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the garage until dawn with legal documents, a yellow notepad, and a fury so focused it felt almost clean. By sunrise, I had done 3 things. I had circled every clause that gave my parents discretionary influence. I had listed everything I knew how to do that generated money. And I had made one decision. I would never ask them for anything again. That sounds dramatic when people say it after the fact. At 18, it was logistical. I still went to Columbia that fall. Technically, my tuition was covered for the first year through a structure already committed before the revision fully applied. After that, the support shifted. Not vanished. Shifted. That was how my parents liked their punishments. Plausibly deniable. Room board could be reassessed. Housing supplements could be deferred. Living expenses could be evaluated based on conduct. It meant they could still tell people they were supporting me while making sure support arrived in forms designed to keep me unstable. So I stopped relying on it before they could pull harder. My freshman dorm room was barely wider than my outstretched arms. It smelled like old heat and institutional detergent. And the radiator clanged all winter like an animal trapped in the wall. I loved it immediately. Not because it was comfortable. Because it was mine. No one in that room had chosen my curtains to send a message. No one there corrected how I sat. No one asked whether my shoes reflected well on the family. I worked constantly. Classes by day. Cataloging inventory by night. I started small. Estate sales in outer boroughs. Craigslist pickups from people who did not know what they were selling. Old lighting fixtures. Drafting tables. Architectural salvage. Brass hardware. Neglected things with bones. I sold what I could for cash. I kept the best margins in spreadsheets so detailed they eventually became more valuable than the objects themselves. Patterns emerged. Neighborhoods where older owners died and younger relatives cleared houses too fast. Categories with emotional underpricing. Items that looked ugly online, but extraordinary in person. Items no one wanted because they needed one competent repair. It was not glamorous. It was also the first time in my life I felt fully awake. At Thanksgiving, I went home because not going would have created a scandal I could not yet afford. The house looked exactly the same. That was the unnerving part. Pain expects visible weather. But wealthy families are very good at maintaining surfaces while rotting in private. My mother kissed my cheek and said I looked tired. My father asked whether architecture still felt practical enough. Graham had brought home a girl named Vivienne with pearl earrings and excellent posture who laughed at all the right places and looked at him like he was already a future board member of something expensive. My trust status was not mentioned. That was worse than mentioning it. The family had a way of burying the knife and then discussing table settings above the wound. After dinner, while my mother supervised dessert plating as if NATO had authorized it, Graham found me in the library. He held a drink and leaned against the doorframe. "How's bohemian poverty?" I shut the ledger I'd been pretending to read. "Better than inherited mediocrity." He smiled. "You know, Dad says you could fix a lot of this by just calming down. There is no this to fix. Come on. Helena, nobody cut you out for no reason." I looked at him. "Do you hear yourself?" He shrugged. "You always wanted to be special?" That sentence stayed with me for years. Not because it hurt, because it clarified him. Graham genuinely believed the problem with me was not that I had been punished unfairly. It was that I had failed to appreciate being managed. That was when I stopped hoping my brother would someday understand me. Hope is expensive. I began protecting my capital. By sophomore year, I was making enough money from resale and sourcing to cover what my parents had started withholding. By junior year, I was doing consulting work for a small Brooklyn developer who had noticed my online notes about salvage pricing and adaptive reuse yield. His name was Martin Vale. He wore scuffed boots, swore too much, and had the rare gift of not being threatened by smart women. He hired me after a single meeting in a noisy diner off Atlantic Avenue, where I showed him why a neglected warehouse listing everyone else had ignored was underpriced by almost 30% once the zoning potential was modeled correctly. He stared at my numbers for a long moment, then said, "How old are you?" 20. "That's irritating." He hired me the next day. That job changed everything. Not because it paid a fortune, because it moved me from flipping objects to understanding assets. From retail margins to structural value, from hustle to systems. Martin taught me how developers lied to themselves, how cities buried opportunity in boring PDFs, how emotion inflated markets and panic discounted them, how rich families often lost money by needing their purchases to look rich before they needed them to be smart. I recognized that one immediately. By 22, while other people from my program were polishing resumes, I was building a private database of distressed mixed-use properties, inheritance disputes, quiet estate liquidations, and neighborhood-level recovery trends. I lived cheaply, aggressively cheaply. I wore second-hand coats that fit beautifully because I knew how to alter them. I learned which bodegas marked down food an hour before closing. I shared a narrow walk-up with 2 women in Crown Heights and slept with my laptop on the floor beside my bed because I could not afford for it to die in a theft. I did not complain. Or rather, I did, but privately and with efficiency. There is a difference between suffering and romanticizing it. I never romanticized mine. I weaponized it. Before I tell you about the first property I bought, and the call from my mother that nearly made me say yes to the very help I had promised myself I would never take again. Drop your city in the comments. I always want to know where people are listening from. At 23, I made my first real move. Not my first sale. Not my first profitable month. My first move. A 3-unit building in Newburgh with terrible listing photos. A leaking roof. And an owner in probate chaos whose sons wanted cash faster than they wanted a fair valuation. Everyone around Martin passed on it. Too messy. Too far. Too ugly. I drove up on a gray Tuesday in February with a legal pad, a flashlight, and gloves because the heat had been shut off and the back stair rail was loose. The place was a disaster. Peeling paint, water stains, a kitchen that smelled faintly of rust and mildew. But the bones were right. The block was early in its turn. Not late. Train access was decent. The numbers worked if you weren't sentimental, and if you were willing to live in one unit while rehabbing the others. I ran the math 12 times. Then I did something that would have horrified my mother. I put nearly everything I had into getting control of it. Not all cash. A patchwork. Savings. Private note. A small partnership Martin structured to test whether I could carry my own risk without drowning in it. He warned me twice. This will either make you, he said, or educate you brutally. Same difference. I told him. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled coffee on the contract. The first 6 months were filthy, exhausting, and glorious. I painted walls in a respirator. I learned more about plumbing than any woman in my family had ever been encouraged to know. I negotiated with contractors who looked over my shoulder for the real decision maker, and then became much more respectful when they realized there wasn't one. I ate too many meals standing up. I slept on an air mattress in one finished room, while the rest of the unit remained a maze of drop cloths and dust. Every time something went wrong, which was constantly, I heard my father's voice in my head calling my life diffuse. Then I fixed one more thing. By 24, the building was cash flowing. Not dramatically, but cleanly, predictably. It was the first money I made that felt like it could keep earning while I slept. That was the addiction. Not spending. Leverage. I rolled profits into another small property. Then another. Nothing luxurious. Nothing cinematic. No montage of champagne and skyline penthus. The real thing looks less glamorous. It looks like legal fees. Deferred gratification. Boring neighborhoods before they become trendy. And saying no to almost everything that makes other people feel successful too early. At 25, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in a hardware store comparing tile prices. Her voice had that brittle brightness that meant she was speaking from a room with other people in it. Helena. Darling. I'm organizing the annual Langford Foundation Gala, and your father thought it might be time you attended again. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was efficient. They had ignored me publicly for years. And now that I was no longer visibly unstable, they wanted me back in the frame. Why? A pause. Then, because you are family. No apology. No acknowledgement. just the soft deployment of a word they only used when it benefited them. I stood in aisle 9 between grout and cock and said, "I was family when you removed me from the trust." Another pause. This one colder. "Must you insist on dramatizing that?" There it was. The old trick. If they hurt you, and you named it, you became the one creating discomfort. My answer is no. I said, "Your grandfather will be disappointed." "I doubt that." Her voice sharpened. "You have become very hard." I looked down at the basket in my hand. At work gloves, utility knives, and invoices? No. I said, "I became expensive." She hung up. I stood there smiling for almost a full minute. Not because I had won anything large. Because for the first time, I heard myself answer her in the language my grandfather had given me years earlier. And I meant it. By 26, my portfolio had crossed a line where people started calling me disciplined instead of lucky. That is another thing about success. When you are a young woman, building quietly, people call you scrappy. When the numbers become undeniable, they rename your personality. I launched a small acquisitions company with 2 partners I actually trusted. One was Martin. The other was Daniel Reyes, a finance attorney I met during a closing where he corrected a bank error without ever raising his voice. He was calm in the way certain men are calm because they know exactly how competent they are. Dark hair, steady eyes, ridiculous patience. He first noticed me because I refused to let a seller's agent rush an inspection deadline. I first noticed him because he listened before he spoke. We became friends slowly. Then allies. Then something else? The first time he came with me to Connecticut, I warned him in the car. My family is very good at being cruel in ways that sound elegant. He glanced over from the driver's seat. Then I'll admire the vocabulary and judge the intent. I smiled despite myself. That weekend was my grandfather's 80th birthday. Big dinner. Too many candles. Too much silver. The house looked almost exactly the same, only smaller. Success does that too. It shrinks the things that once intimidated you. My mother greeted Daniel with immediate warmth, which told me she had already decided he was useful. My father liked that he was a lawyer. Graham disliked him on sight. That also told me a great deal. During cocktails on the terrace, my mother asked Daniel where his family was from. He answered, "Texas. Mostly." She smiled. How wonderfully American. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Daniel took a sip of water and said, "That tends to happen after several generations." My father coughed into his glass to hide a reaction. Graham looked delighted in the ugly way. Men look delighted when they think a woman's relationship is about to become socially inconvenient. Daniel did not give him that satisfaction. That was the evening my grandfather asked me, in front of everyone, how many units I had under management. The table went quiet. Not completely, but enough. I gave him the real number. He nodded once. And occupancy? I gave him that too. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My mother stared at her plate for just a fraction too long. Graham asked, "You're still doing the real estate thing?" "Still." I turned toward him. "Yes, it turns out assets don't care whether you approve of them." My grandfather laughed. A real laugh. Deep and brief and impossible to misinterpret. That was when the balance began to shift. Not publicly. Not all at once. But old families are like large ships. You feel the turn before anyone admits it's happening. I did not know it then. But that dinner was the first time my family understood my life had become difficult to dismiss. Not because they respected me. Respect would have required humility. What they felt first was disruption. I had become inconvenient to the story they had been telling themselves about me for years. In their version, I was the erratic daughter. The emotional one. The impractical one. The girl who had chosen interesting over respectable and would eventually crawl back needing rescue. But inconvenient facts had started piling up. I was not unstable. I was not drifting. And worst of all, from their perspective, I had done well without their permission. A month after my grandfather's birthday dinner, Daniel and I were in my office in Brooklyn, reviewing a seller financing structure for a 6-unit acquisition when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I let it ring once. Twice. Daniel glanced up from the stack of papers between us. "You're deciding whether to answer?" he said. "I'm deciding whether I'm in the mood to be managed." He leaned back in his chair. "That sounds like a no." "It usually is." But I answered anyway. "Helena." Her voice was controlled. Too controlled. My mother did not sound controlled unless something underneath her was moving fast. "There's been a development," she said. I said nothing. "Your grandfather has taken ill." The room changed. Not dramatically, but enough that even the daylight at the windows felt sharper. "How ill?" "He collapsed this morning." My hand tightened around the phone. "Is he conscious?" "Yes. Intermittently. The doctors are optimistic. But given his age..." She let the sentence trail off. My mother loved a sentence she did not have to finish. It let other people fill it with fear for her. "I'll come," I said. When I hung up, Daniel was already closing his laptop. "I'm driving." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never mistook devotion for obligation. The drive to Connecticut took just over 2 hours. Though grief has a way of distorting time into something either sticky or brutal, that day it felt both. My grandfather was in a private suite on the cardiac floor when we arrived. The family was already there. My father stood near the window, speaking quietly to a doctor. My mother sat perfectly upright on a sofa with her handbag clasped in both hands, as if posture itself might control mortality. Graham was pacing with his phone. He stopped when he saw me. Then his eyes moved to Daniel. "Of course," he said. I ignored him. There are people who only gain access to your attention by behaving badly. Removing that access is one of the cheapest forms of power. When I stepped into my grandfather's room, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. That frightened me more than the machines. He had always seemed built from some older material than other people. Even weakened. He still gave the impression that the room was rearranging itself around his will. His eyes opened when I approached. "Helena." His voice was rough. I moved closer to the bed. "I'm here." He studied my face for a second, then glanced past me toward the glass wall. "Not them." I understood. I looked back at Daniel. "Can you give us a minute?" He nodded and stepped outside. I closed the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my grandfather said, "Your mother has been circling the lawyers." I almost laughed at how unsurprised I felt. She usually circles anything she thinks might become available. His mouth twitched. That was as close to amusement as he had strength for. "Listen carefully," he said. "There are documents in Bellamy's possession that your father does not control." I sat down beside the bed. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that make cowards nervous." Even then, sick and tired, he could not resist dramatics when the drama was earned. I lowered my voice. "What did you do?" He watched me for a long moment. "Something I should have done earlier." That answer told me two things. First, he knew he had been wrong in at least part of what he had allowed. Second, whatever he had done was serious enough that he had not told the others yet. My throat tightened. Am I supposed to be worried? No? Should they be? Yes. It was the first moment in years that I felt the old axis between us begin to shift from test to recognition. Not approval. Something deeper. Regret. Perhaps. Or respect sharpened by time. He moved his hand weakly against the sheet, and I took it. His skin felt papery and warm. I underestimated the damage, he said. I frowned. The trust? No. His eyes held mine. The family? That was the closest he had ever come to an apology. And because it was him, because he was not a man who spent words carelessly, it landed harder than a speech would have. I swallowed. You did? I know. We sat in silence for a moment, machines pulsing softly in the background. Then he said, "Have you built what I thought you would?" I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Yes. How much? I gave him a conservative version. Not because I did not trust him. Because old instincts die slowly, especially around family wealth. His brows lifted anyway. Well, he said, that should annoy them magnificently. I smiled despite the knot in my chest. A nurse came in a few minutes later, and I stepped back. As I opened the door, my father straightened from the wall outside. What did he say? He asked how I was. My father searched my face. He knew there was more. He also knew asking directly would reveal too much interest. That was one of the habits the men in my family shared. They preferred control disguised as dignity. The next week was a blur of hospital updates, postponed meetings, and the strange emotional whiplash that comes from trying to protect a business life while a foundational person in your private life is weakening in front of you. This is the part people romanticize when they tell stories about revenge. They imagine a clean emotional arc. Hurt, drive, victory. But real life does not honor pacing. The same week I was preparing term sheets for a multi-property acquisition in Newark. I was also standing in a hospital bathroom, trying not to cry, because my grandfather had needed help lifting a glass of water. Money does not soften that kind of helplessness. Success does not make the body less fragile. And no amount of vindication cancels the grief of watching someone formidable become mortal by inches. That was the week my mother changed tactics. She began calling me directly with updates. I knew she could have sent in a text. At first it looked like simple practicality. Then I noticed the content. Not just, the cardiologist changed his medication. Not just, he may be discharged by Thursday. It was the other details. Your father is exhausted. Graham has taken on so much. There is quite a lot to think about now. I recognized the rhythm immediately. She was softening the ground, preparing me to view them as burdened rather than opportunistic. My mother believed in narrative management the way some people believe in religion. One evening, she called while I was walking back from a site inspection in Queens. The sky was low and gray, and my boots were still dusty from an unfinished stairwell. "Helena," she said, "if the family needs to make some decisions soon, I hope you won't make things difficult." I stopped on the sidewalk. There it was. Not concern. Positioning. What decisions? Oh, don't be naive. That line almost impressed me. As if the problem were not her ambition, but my refusal to politely ignore it. I resumed walking. "I'm not the one circling a sick man's estate plan." Her voice cooled instantly. "You always did prefer to assume the worst?" "No," I said. "I learned—" She hung up. Daniel was at my apartment when I got home. Sleeves rolled up. Making pasta in the tiny kitchen because he had somehow decided domestic competence was romantic, and I had no intention of correcting him. He looked at my face once and turned off the stove. "What happened?" I set my bag down. "She's already planning post-mortem politics." He leaned against the counter. "Do you want the legal answer or the human one?" "Start with human." "They're scared." "Of what?" "Of what happens when the story gets reopened." I was too tired to pretend not to understand. My family had survived for years by treating my exclusion as settled history. Not because it was ethical, because it was administratively convenient. But old decisions are safest when the person harmed by them remains visibly smaller than the people who made them. I was no longer smaller. And my grandfather, from what little he had implied, had done something with that fact. "What's the legal answer?" I asked. Daniel's expression changed. More focused. More exact. "If Bellamy is holding independent documents, then your grandfather anticipated internal conflict. Men like that only create parallel paper when they no longer trust the people nearest them." I sat down at the table. "So they should be nervous?" "Yes." That answer should have made me feel triumphant. Instead, it made me sad. There is something ugly about realizing your family has become a risk environment. Not difficult. Not flawed. A risk environment. A place where legal structure matters because emotional trust has already failed. My grandfather came home after 10 days in the hospital. Though, home in that season meant nurses, medication schedules, and a hush that settled over the Langford house like a warning. I visited twice a week. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with Daniel. Graham started coming by more often too. Always, with the visible fatigue of a man performing filial duty where witnesses might eventually matter. He brought expensive fruit baskets. He took calls loudly in the hall. He asked staff whether his grandfather had seemed lucid in tones, meant to sound concerned and actually designed to gather intelligence. By then, I knew his pattern well enough to stop mistaking it for affection. My father became more controlling, as my grandfather weakened. That is another thing fear does in certain men. It does not soften them. It sharpens their appetite for structure. He began coordinating appointments, controlling information, questioning advisors, and speaking as if stewardship had already passed to him by natural law. One afternoon, I arrived to find him in the study with Mr. Traim. Belame. The door was partly open. I was not trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my father say, "Any revisions at this stage would be irresponsible." Bellamy replied in the careful tone of a man whose profession required him never to sound alarmed in front of rich people. "My responsibility is to the client, Harold. Not the family, not the presumptive heir. The client." I stayed where I was just long enough to hear my father say, "My father is under enormous strain." Then I walked away before my presence could become part of the conversation. That night I sat with my grandfather while rain tapped against the windows, and the house smelled faintly of old wood and medicine. He looked tired, but his mind was clear. "Your father cornered Bellamy today," I said. I expected him to. "You really didn't tell them?" "No." "Why not?" He shifted slightly in the armchair, blanket over his knees. "Because when weak men think succession belongs to them, they reveal themselves beautifully." I smiled without meaning to. Only he could make surveillance sound like pedagogy. Then his face grew more serious. "When this is over, they will try to make your restraint look like aggression." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means they have had 12 years to describe you as unstable. If you defend yourself too loudly, they will call it proof." He was right. He usually was when human weakness was involved. So what do I do? Hemet Magaza. Tell the truth. Slowly. That sentence stayed with me. Tell the truth. Slowly. Not because it was poetic. Because it was tactical. People lie in clusters. Truth wins by remaining upright longer than the performance can. My grandfather died on a Sunday morning in late October. It was cold enough that the trees along the drive had gone from gold to bare in less than a week. I got the call at 6:12 a.m. I knew before I answered. There is a tone grief takes before it becomes language. By 8 I was at the house. The staff had already begun moving through the rituals wealthy families assign to death. Coffee appearing silently. Phones ringing in distant rooms. Flowers being relocated. Coats taken. Voices lowered into expensive sorrow. My mother was in the blue sitting room receiving condolences, as if she had been rehearsing for years. My father stood near the fireplace speaking in hushed, firm sentences to someone from the funeral home. Graham hugged people with one hand and checked his phone with the other. I went upstairs. Not because it was appropriate, because I could not bear the performance yet. My grandfather's room was still. The bed had been stripped. The curtains were partly open. A pair of reading glasses sat on the side table beside a book he had not finished. That was what broke me. Not the death itself. The interruption. The ordinary object waiting for a hand that would never return. I sat in the chair by the window and cried for the first time since the hospital. Quietly at first. Then not. Grief is one of the few forces stronger than self-presentation. In that room I was not the excluded daughter. Not the successful one. Not the threat. Just a granddaughter who had loved a difficult man in a difficult way and now had nowhere left to put that love. When I came downstairs, Daniel was there. He crossed the entry hall without drawing attention and took my hand once. Briefly. In a way that said everything public etiquette would not permit. That was enough. The funeral was 3 days later. Old Stone Church. Too many lilies. a pew arrangement that quietly communicated hierarchy even in mourning. My father gave a eulogy built from the approved vocabulary of legacy men. Discipline, duty, excellence, principle. It was not false. That was the frustrating part. It simply was not complete. Graham spoke briefly afterward, performing emotion with the exact moderation he believed respectable. My mother cried at the right moments. I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say, because funerals are where families disguise themselves as their best intentions, and I was not willing to wrestle ghosts for accuracy in a church. The reading of the estate documents was scheduled for the following Monday at Bellamy and Cross. That was the meeting I had opened this story with. The mahogany office. The suits? The quiet assumption that old money would continue moving in the direction it always had. When Daniel offered to come, I said yes before pride could interfere. Good, he said, because I wasn't asking. Atno, cintize cicintia, M. We walked into Bellamy's conference room. My mother was already seated, pale in a cream jacket that probably cost more than my first renovation budget. My father stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Graham sat with one ankle over a knee, projecting the kind of ease men cultivate when they think good news belongs to them. Bellamy greeted me with professional gravity. Then he looked at Daniel and gave a short nod that told me two things. First, he knew exactly who Daniel was. Second, my father had probably noticed that too, and disliked it. Visat. Folders were distributed. Water was poured. No one drank it. Bellamy began with routine matters first. Bequests, philanthropic allocations, operational transitions. Then he adjusted his glasses and said, "As you know, the Langford Family Trust was restructured 12 years ago." My mother lowered her eyes. My father remained still. Graham actually smirked. It was small, fast, but I saw it. He thought we had reached the part where old humiliation became permanent record. Bellamy continued. At the time of that restructuring, 1. Beneficiaries' future distributions and standing were suspended pending review under the Conduct and Alignment Clause. He did not say my name immediately. He did not need to. The room already knew. The air had become a held breath. I sat perfectly still. Not because I was calm, because this was the moment my grandfather had warned me about. If I moved too soon, they would frame my reaction as the story. However, Bellamy said, opening a second folder, Charles Langford executed a sealed amendment 3 years later, followed by a final letter of directive 9 months ago. That got my father's attention. He turned away from the window. "I'm sorry," he said. "A sealed amendment?" Bellamy did not flinch. "Yes." Why was the family not informed? Because it was sealed. For the first time in my adult life, I had to fight not to smile in front of my father. Bellamy looked at me briefly. Then back to the documents. In the amendment, Mr. Langford states that the suspension of Helena Langford's beneficiary status was intended as a temporary stress test of independence and character. He further states that the conduct of other family members in relation to that suspension provided information he considered materially relevant to succession planning. Silence. No one even attempted elegance. My mother's lips parted slightly. Graham's smirk disappeared. My father said, very quietly. That is absurd. Bellamy continued as if he had not spoken. In the final directive, Charles Langford restores Helena Langford fully and permanently as a trust beneficiary. Removes Harold Langford's discretionary oversight authority. Reduces Graham Langford's future managerial role to non-voting participation pending performance review. And assigns controlling stewardship transition to an independent board structure, with Helena Langford named as strategic oversight co-chair, should she choose to accept. The room seemed to tilt. It did not. Of course. But anyone who has spent years in a family system knows this feeling. The moment the official version collapses and everyone present is suddenly forced to meet reality without narrative makeup. My mother spoke first. This cannot be right. Bellamy turned a page. It is signed, witnessed, and executed. My father's face had gone the strange color powerful men take on when they realize outrage will not restore control. He was ill, he said. The original sealed amendment predates his illness by 9 years. Bellamy replied. That was the first clean hit. Not emotional. Procedural. The most effective kind in rooms like that. Graham sat forward. So what? She gets rewarded for being difficult? There it was. At 32 years old. With a lawyer, documents, and his grandfather's final instructions on the table. My brother still believed the central problem was my refusal to be manageable. I turned toward him. Do you hear yourself? He opened his mouth again. But Bellamy raised one hand. There is more. He removed a single-page letter from a separate envelope. This is not legally operative language, he said. But Mr. Langford specifically instructed that it be read aloud at the family conference. My father looked murderous. My mother looked frightened for the first time that morning. Bellamy read, If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And Harold is likely standing too straight. Eleanor is pretending not to understand what ambition looks like in a widow's posture. And Graham is confusing inheritance with merit. That alone was enough to crack the room open. Graham's face flushed instantly. My mother went rigid. But Bellamy kept reading. Helena was not removed because she lacked character. She was removed because the family found her difference inconvenient. I permitted that error longer than I should have. In doing so, I learned 2 things. First, she could build without our shelter. Second, too many of the rest of you could not distinguish stewardship from entitlement. Bellamy paused only once, perhaps to confirm to himself that he truly had to continue. I direct that Helena be given every document relevant to the original suspension, including internal correspondence. Transparency is now more valuable than reputation. If any member of this family objects, they are welcome to build something of their own. Daniel looked down, hiding what I suspect was admiration. My father did not move. Not 1 inch. Bellamy finished the letter. Money is easiest to inherit and hardest to deserve. Helena understands the difference. The rest of you may wish to learn it belatedly. Then he folded the page. No one spoke. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the low hiss of the heating system. My mother turned to me first, which surprised me. Not because she had anything useful to say, because even then, instinct drove her toward narrative salvage. Helena, she said softly. Surely you understand your grandfather could be severe. We should not let a private family matter become. She searched for the word. Public. Embarrassing. Messu. Real. Divisive. She finished. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about every year they had relied on my silence to keep their version intact. Every dinner where I had been treated like an eccentric cautionary tale. Every financial decision engineered to leave me unstable enough to be corrected. Every time my pain had been called dramatics because admitting it would have cost them image. Then I remembered my grandfather's voice. Tell the truth. Slowly. So I did. Divisive. I said. Was removing me from the family trust at 18 for being different? My mother's shoulders stiffened. Helena. No. You don't get to skip to peace, because the paperwork turned against you. My father's tone went sharp. That is enough. I turned to him. No, it isn't. For the first time in my life, I did not feel younger than him. I did not feel outnumbered. I did not feel like the odd piece at the edge of the family portrait. I felt precise. You called it alignment? I said. What you meant was obedience. You called it standards. What you meant was resemblance. You called it concern about my direction while using money to punish me for not becoming socially useful to you. My father stared at me. There are men who believe authority is a natural force, like gravity. Those men take contradiction personally. You are speaking emotionally, he said. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Not because he intended to intervene, because he was preparing, if necessary, to dismantle that sentence professionally. I got there first? No, I said. I'm speaking accurately. Graham laughed once under his breath. This is unbelievable. You're worth what now? Exactly? A few buildings and a chip on your shoulder? And there it was. The opening he gave me entirely by himself. In families like mine, the most arrogant person in the room is often also the most useful, because he cannot resist making the quiet part measurable. I looked at Bellamy. Am I permitted to answer that? Bellamy said. This is not a formal valuation session. Daniel, without raising his voice, added, but there is no prohibition on factual clarification. My father shot him a look. Daniel did not carry. I folded my hands on the table. Since you asked? I said to Graham, my net worth is currently a little more than triple the present value of the trust you all worked so hard to keep from me. That was the second the room truly changed. Before then, they had been dealing with moral reversal. After that, they had to confront status reversal. And for people like my family, those are not the same thing. My mother blinked. Once? Twice. Graham actually laughed again. But weaker this time. That's absurd. Daniel slid a slim folder across the table. Not theatrically. Not triumphantly. Just enough. I advised against bringing this unless needed, he said. But since someone raised the issue. Inside were summary statements. Conservative ones. I had not wanted to make the day about numbers. But I had also learned long ago that some people only recognize truth when it arrives in a format they fear. My father did not touch the folder. My mother did. That told me everything. Her eyes moved across the top page. Then down. Her face changed in tiny increments. Color fading. Mouth tightening. Posture adjusting to a world she no longer understood her position in. Graham leaned toward her. What? She handed him the paper without answering. He looked, then looked again. People imagine vindication feels hot, explosive, but the deepest kind often feels cold, still, like a door quietly sealing behind you, while the people on the other side finally realize you had been carrying the hinges. My father spoke at last. So this was all about proving something. I almost pitied him. Almost. Because even then, even with everything laid bare, he still needed my success to be reactive rather than real. As if the only explanation for a daughter building something formidable was that she had done it in relation to him. No. I said, that's the part you still don't understand. I built my life because I had one. You just happened to make the beginning of it more expensive. Bellamy cleared his throat gently and moved to the next item. Operational timelines. Disclosure procedures. Board appointments. Most of it passed in a blur for the others. I think. Shock makes people selectively deaf. But I listened. Carefully. Because this was the difference between symbolic victory and structural consequence. And if my family had taught me anything useful, it was this. Never mistake an emotional win for a durable one. When the meeting ended, chairs moved back. Papers were collected. No one reached for me. No one hugged. My mother stood first. Helena, she said, perhaps you and I should speak privately. I looked at her. At the woman who had spent half my life trying to edit me into someone easier to display. At the woman who had called my pain dramatics and my resistance hardness and my independence divisive when it inconvenienced her. And for one dangerous second, a younger part of me wanted it. The private conversation, the softening, the overdue acknowledgement. Not because I trusted it, because children, even grown ones, can remain vulnerable to the shape of the apology they never got. Then I noticed something. She did not look remorseful. She looked strategic. That killed the last of it. No, I said. The word landed quietly. But quiet can be final in ways shouting never achieves. Her expression changed. Not much. Just enough for me to see she had not expected refusal in front of witnesses. My father gathered his papers with movements too, controlled to be natural. This family has handled private matters privately for generations. I looked at him, and that is why so much of it stayed rotten. Then Daniel and I left. Outside. The air was cold enough to sting. I stood on the sidewalk in front of Bellamy and Cross while traffic moved steadily through downtown Hartford and felt something I had not expected. Not joy. Not triumph. Relief. Pure and enormous. Like setting down a weight you had stopped noticing because you had carried it for so long. Daniel touched the small of my back. You okay? I let out a slow breath. Yes. Then I laughed once. Not because anything was funny, but because my body did not know where else to put that much released tension. Yes, I said again. I think I finally am. We walked to the car in silence. Halfway there, he said. For the record, your grandfather's letter was vicious. I looked at him. He always did have range. Daniel smiled. I would have liked him. You did like him? I know. I would have liked more time. That was the grief in it. Not just that my grandfather had finally corrected the structure, That he had done it so late. Too late for us to ever sit across from each other without the test between us. Too late for him to watch what I had built in peace instead of from the edge of his own ending. A week later, Bellamy's office sent the internal correspondence referenced in the directive. Emails. Memoranda. Notes. The archaeological record of my exclusion. I read all of it alone. Some of it I expected. My father's language was exactly as sterile as I remembered. Concerns about image. Consistency. Optics. My mother's messages were worse in their own way because they were written in the language of social polish. She may eventually thank us for enforcing clarity. Too much latitude only deepens the tendency toward rebellion. And then there was Graham, the youngest, dumbest cruelty in the archive. A message written when he was 20. If Helena wants to cosplay struggle, maybe let her. It'll either fix her or prove the point. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it surprised me, because seeing contempt preserved in writing does something brutal to the nervous system. It removes all remaining room for reinterpretation. This is the gravity nobody talks about in stories like mine. Not the trust. Not the money. Not the meeting. The fact that the people who should have defended your existence instead discussed your pain as strategy. For a few days after reading the file, I could barely work. I kept moving through my routines. Calls. Inspections. Financial reviews. But underneath it, something old and raw had reopened. Success is not anesthesia. You can own buildings, sign contracts, manage teams, and still have an inner child wrecked by a sentence written 12 years earlier. One night I woke up at 3:17 the morning with my heart pounding so hard I thought for a moment something was physically wrong. Daniel found me sitting on the floor in the kitchen drinking water in the dark. He did not ask, "What's wrong?" He sat down beside me and waited. That is a rare kindness. To make space before demanding coherence. After a minute I said, "I think part of me always believed maybe I had exaggerated it." He looked at me. "The way they treated you? The intent?" I laughed once. Harshly. It sounds stupid when I say it out loud. "No," he said. "It sounds human." That was the moment I understood something I wish more people said plainly. Vindication does not erase damage. It clarifies it. And sometimes clarity hurts more before it heals because you are no longer allowed to lie to yourself about what happened. If this story has ever felt familiar to you, type karma in the comments. Not because I believe in magic. Because sometimes the only thing more healing than justice is hearing from people who know exactly what it cost before it arrived. Over the following months, the practical consequences settled in. The independent board moved forward. My father lost discretionary influence, exactly as the directive required. Graham, deprived of the automatic future he had assumed was waiting for him, began making the kinds of mistakes men make when entitlement has kept them from developing actual endurance. He overplayed confidence in meetings, underdelivered on assigned work, resented oversight. That, too, was clarifying. My mother attempted 2 more times to arrange a private lunch. Each request arrived through language softened almost to translucence. Healing. Misunderstanding. Family. I declined both. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just clearly. No is one of the most underused forms of architecture in adult life. It builds rooms where your nervous system can finally rest. At Christmas, for the first time in memory, I did not go to the Langford house. Daniel and I spent the holiday in a rented cabin in Vermont, with a fireplace that smoked too much and a kitchen too small for the elaborate meal he insisted on cooking anyway. Snow fell most of Christmas Eve. We drank wine and argued over whether his stuffing recipe was better than mine, and went to bed before midnight because adulthood eventually teaches you that peace can be festive too. The next morning, my mother sent a photograph of the family dining room. Silver. Candles. 3 place settings visible. No message. Just the image. For a long time, I would have read that as longing. Invitation. Regret. That day I read it correctly. A bid for emotional access without accountability. I did not respond. Instead, I put my phone face down and went outside into the cold, bright air where the snow was still untouched across the yard. Daniel joined me a minute later, carrying 2 mugs. He handed me one. We stood there looking at the trees. After a while, he said, "Do you miss them?" I considered the question carefully. Not because I was confused, because precision matters when speaking about loss. I miss who family should have been. I said, "I don't miss the system." He nodded. "That sounds expensive too." It was. By spring, Bellamy informed me that one final item remained from my grandfather's papers. A sealed personal note addressed only to me. I opened it alone in my office. It was short. That was his way. Helena. If you are reading this, then I was right about one thing and late about another. I was right that you would build. I was late in understanding that endurance should not have been the price of belonging. Do not confuse correction with reconciliation. Some people learn, others merely lose leverage. You owe no one access simply because they share your blood. Build wisely. Love selectively. Leave clean books. Grandfather. I read it 3 times. Then I put it back in the envelope and sat very still. People talk about closure as if it arrives like weather. It doesn't. It arrives like accounting. Slow. Precise. Line by line. You do not wake up healed. You notice, one day, that an old trigger no longer runs your breathing, that a phone call no longer ruins your week, that a room you once entered, braced for injury, now feels merely decorated. That is what closure looked like for me. Not reunion. Not dramatic forgiveness. Not my parents suddenly discovering depth. Just the gradual return of internal ownership. A year after the reading, I accepted the co-chair role on the board. Not because I needed the money. I did not. And not because I wanted proximity to the family machine. I didn't. I accepted because structures matter. Because if I walked away entirely, the old culture would eventually reassemble itself under cleaner language. Because there were junior beneficiaries coming up behind us. And I had no interest in watching another young woman get told her difference was a liability, while the men around her called it governance. At my first major board session, Graham arrived late. He sat down hard, nodded at no one, and launched into a proposal, so obviously underprepared that even the independent members looked embarrassed for him. Halfway through, he referenced leverage assumptions that were 6 months out of date. I corrected him, calmly. With numbers, he stopped speaking. The room moved on. That was all. No explosion. No scene. Just competence, replacing mythology in real time. After the meeting, he caught me in the corridor. This is what you wanted, isn't it? I looked at him. He still had the same handsome face, the same cultivated ease. But there was something underneath it now I had never seen before. Uncertainty. And because I had once spent so many years wishing he would understand me, I expected to feel something larger in that moment. I didn't. Only distance. No. I said, this is what happened. He scoffed. You always have to make everything a lesson. And you always mistake consequences for attacks? He stepped closer. You think you're better than us? I almost answered quickly. Then I stopped. Because some questions deserve accuracy, not speed. I think. I said. I built a life without needing to shrink for it. If that feels like an insult to you, you should ask yourself why. He did not have an answer. Men like my brother usually don't when the room no longer supplies one for them. I walked away. That was the last meaningful conversation we had. My parents and I settled into what I can only call formal distance. Cards on birthdays. Occasional updates through assistants or Bellamy's office when trust matters required signatures. One carefully staged invitation to a summer dinner, I declined. No screaming estrangement. No movie scene reconciliation. Just boundaries held so consistently, they became architecture. And honestly, that ending fit the truth better than forgiveness ever could. Because forgiveness without repair is just one more performance. Poor people are taught to offer for free while wealthy families call themselves evolved. The real ending happened on a rainy Thursday in September. Almost 2 years after the reading, I was in Manhattan for a closing and stopped afterward at a hotel bar to meet Daniel. The place was quiet. Low lamps. Dark wood. The kind of room where finance people whisper as if volume itself might hurt the Tao. I arrived first. As I was taking off my coat, I saw my parents across the room. Not together. My mother was seated at a corner table with 2 women I recognized from old gala circuits. My father stood near the host stand, speaking to a man in a cashmere overcoat. For a second, none of us moved. Then my mother saw me clearly. Her spine changed. Not much. Just enough. She excused herself from her table and walked over. She looked older. Not diminished. Just more visible. Age does that when performance begins to cost more than it returns. Helena. Mother. There was a brief silence. Rain moved softly against the windows. Background piano drifted in from somewhere near the lobby. I heard about the closing, she said. Congratulations. Thank you. Another silence. Then, to my surprise, she said, you were right about some things. Not everything. Of course not. My mother would rather swallow crystal than surrender cleanly. But even partial truth can be startling from someone who once lived on curation. I held her gaze. Some? A faint smile. Tired. Not strategic this time. Just tired. That's as generous as I am likely to become. It was not enough. But for the first time, it sounded real. And because it sounded real, I answered honestly. That's more than you used to give. She looked down briefly. Then back up. I don't expect closeness, she said. I do hope. Eventually. For civility. I thought about that. Not in the old hungry way. Not as a daughter bargaining for crumbs. As a woman evaluating terms. You have civility. I said, what you don't have is access. Something in her face tightened, then settled. She nodded once. I suppose that is fair. Fair. My mother had never liked the word when it applied to me. This time she let it stand. My father did not come over. He looked once in our direction, then away. That was his version of surrender. Not confession. Not apology. Just the quiet recognition that he no longer controlled the frame. Daniel arrived a minute later and joined me at the bar. My mother gave him a small nod, then returned to her table. He waited until she was gone before asking. That seemed almost civilized. It was. How do you feel? I considered the question. Then I looked around the room, at the rain-dark glass, at my reflection faintly layered over the city beyond it, at the woman I had become, not because suffering had ennobled me. Suffering usually doesn't. Because I had turned experience into discernment and pain into structure. Because I had learned that belonging given conditionally is just control in softer clothes. Because I had finally stopped confusing being chosen by family with being worthy in the first place. Rich, I said. Daniel laughed. I don't mean the balance sheet. He leaned on the bar. I know. And that is the truth of it. At 18, they cut me out of the family trust for being different. By 30, my net worth was triple the entire trust. But that was never the most important reversal. The real reversal was this. They thought exclusion would make me smaller. It made me exact. They thought discomfort would make me obedient. It made me discerning. They thought money was power because it had always worked that way inside the house on the hill. What they never understood was that money only controls you when you still need it to prove you belong. I don't. And I never will again.